Episode 34, West Virginia Penitentiary. Hey y'all, I'm Heather, and this is Poisoned Appalachia, the dark side of Appalachia. As always, thank you for listening. I hope you enjoyed my wholesome Appalachia episode on Sequoia, if you listened to it. If not, that's okay. I understand. I like the dark side too. Today I want to talk about the West Virginia Penitentiary, commonly called the Moundsville Prison. So, if I switch back and forth, that's why. I'll try to stick with West Virginia Penitentiary, but just in case you hear me say Moundsville Prison, that's what's going on. This is a place I've actually been to, or at least drove by, which is rare for me, as you all know. I try generally not to do 2 West Virginia ones in a row, but I decided to do this one because I've had it on my list for a while. Which I did have Sequoia in between, so it's not like they were back to back. So I guess now is as good a time as ever to talk about it. I've mentioned this on prior episodes. I know the Hatfield-McCoy one and maybe another one, but West Virginia used to be Virginia. West Virginia wasn't created until the Civil War. In 1863, West Virginia seceded from Virginia at the height of the American Civil War. West Virginia was the only state in the Union to separate from a Confederate state, Virginia, during the Civil War. In Richmond on April 17, 1861, the Virginia Secession Convention of 1861 voted to secede from the Union, but of the 49 delegates from the northwestern corner, which ultimately became West Virginia, only 17 voted in favor of the Ordinance of Secession, while 30 voted against it, with 2 abstentions. Because it was a new state with a new government, they had a shortage of various public institutions, including prisons. So from 1863 to 1866, Governor Arthur I. Borman lobbied the West Virginia legislature for a state penitentiary, but was repeatedly denied. The legislature at first directed him to send the prisoners to other institutions out of state, and then they decided to use the existing county jails. Both options turned out to be inadequate. After 9 inmates escaped in 1865, the local press took up the cause and the legislature took action. An act of the legislature in 1866 directed the Board of Public Works to select a site of not less than 10 acres of land in or near Moundsville and to appoint a board of directors. They appropriated $50,000 to buy land and begin construction. The site that was chosen in Moundsville is directly across from Grave Creek Mound, now a National Historic Landmark in 1964, and on the National Registry of Historic Places in 1966. Penitentiary was also listed on the NRHP in 1996. On February 7, 1866, the state legislature approved the purchase of land in Moundsville for the purpose of constructing a state prison. 10 acres were purchased just outside the then city limits of Moundsville for $3,000. Moundsville proved an attractive site as it was approximately 12 miles south of Wheeling, West Virginia, which was the state capital at the time. The state built a temporary wooden prison nearby that summer. This gave prison officials time to assess what prison design should be used. They had chosen a modified version of the design of the Northern Illinois Penitentiary at Joliet, Illinois. Its Gothic Revival architecture exhibited as much as possible great strength and conveyed to the mind a cheerless blank indicative of the misery which awaits the unhappy being who enters within its walls. Today's prisons look like schools, but back then they looked like castles and dungeons. The prison at Joliet provided the prototype for the West Virginia Penitentiary. It was an imposing stone structure fashioned in the castellated Gothic architecture style, adorned with turrets and battlements like a castle. Only the dimensions of West Virginia's facility would differ. It would be approximately 1/2 the size of Joliet. No architectural designs of the West Virginia Penitentiary have been discovered, so an understanding of the plan developed by the Board of Directors must be obtained through their 1867 report, which details the procurement of a title for 10 acres of land and a proposal to enclose about 7 acres. On the north side would be a street 60 feet in width, and on the west side, 140 feet for street and yard to the front buildings. The prison yard would be a parallelogram 682.5 feet in length by 352.5 feet in width, enclosed by a stone wall 5 feet in thickness at the bottom, 2.5 feet at the top, with foundation 5 feet below the surface, as well as 25 inches thick. At each of the corners of this wall would be large turrets for the use of guards, with inside staircases. Guards' rooms would be above on a level with the top of the main. The superintendent's house and cell buildings would be so placed that the rear wall of each would form part of the west wall. The first building construction on the site was the North Wagon Gate. It was made with hand-cut sandstone, which was quarried from a local site. The state used prison labor during the construction process and work continued on the first phase until 1876. When completed, the total cost of the building was $363,061. In addition to the North Wagon Gate, there was now North and South cell block areas, measuring both 300 feet by 52 feet. South Hall had 224 cells, 7 feet by 4 feet, and North Hall had a kitchen, dining area, hospital, and chapel. A 4-story tower connecting the two was the administration building, measuring 75 feet by 75 feet. It included space for female inmates and personal living quarters for the warden and his family. The facility officially opened in 1876, and it had a prison population of 251 male inmates, including some who had helped construct the prison where they were incarcerated. After this phase, work began on the prison workshops and other secondary facilities. In addition to construction, the inmates had other jobs to do in support of the prison. In the early 1900s, some industries within the prison walls included a carpentry shop, a paint shop, a wagon shop, and a stone yard, a brickyard, a blacksmith, a tailor, a bakery, and a hospital. At the same time, revenue from the prison farm and inmate labor helped the prison financially, which meant that it was virtually self-sufficient. A prison coal mine located a mile away, opened in 1921, helped fill some of the prison's energy needs and saved the state an estimated $14,000 a year. Some inmates were allowed to stay at the mine's camp under supervision of a mine foreman who was not a prison employee. The century-old brick medieval style is listed on the National Register of Historic Places, which I kind of mentioned earlier. It opened in 1867 with 840 cells for men and 32 for women. Female prisoners were transferred to a new women's prison in 1947. But before I go into more of the prison, I wanted to take a little time to talk about Moundsville, West Virginia, which is where the prison is. This is from the City of Moundsville website. Moundsville, the county seat of Marshall County, is located on the Ohio River at the mouth of Grave Creek. Joseph Samuel and James Tomlinson built the first cabin on the flats of Grave Creek in 1771. In 1798, Joseph Tomlinson laid out lots in a tract named Elizabethtown in honor of his wife, Elizabeth Harkness Tomlinson. In 1832, neighboring Moundsville was established on land owned by Simeon Purdy. Elizabethtown, incorporated in 1830, was named the county seat when Marshall County was formed in 1835. The first courthouse was used from 1836 until 1875. The second and current courthouse opened in 1876. Moundsville was named for Grave Creek Mound, built by Adena Indians between 250 BC and 150 BC. The largest earthen conical burial mound in North America, Grave Creek Mound is 240 feet in diameter and 62 feet high. It is maintained by the state of West Virginia as part of the Grave Creek Mound Archaeological Complex, which includes the adjacent Delph Norona Museum, named for Delph Norona, a founder of the West Virginia Archaeological Society who helped establish a museum on the site in 1952. In 1866, Elizabethtown and Moundsville were consolidated under the name of Moundsville. The first recorded school was established in the community in 1799. School sessions were held regularly by 1826. Free schools were established in Moundsville in 1866. The first public building was a jail, completed in 1836. In July 1866, work began on the West Virginia Penitentiary. The maximum security prison remained in operation in Moundsville until 1995. After the prison was closed, the North Regional Jail and Correctional Facility was constructed in Moundsville. Early industries included ironworks, factories, tanneries, mills, and coal mining. In the 20th century, Fostoria Glass Company produced art, glass, dinnerware, and U.S. stamping made enamel at Moundsville. Novelist Davis Grubb was born in Moundsville and often featured the community in his writings, usually as a fictitious Glory, West Virginia. Two of his novels are adapted to major motion pictures, Night of the Hunter and Fool's Parade, both filmed in Moundsville. Night of the Hunter was based on Harry Power's story. I covered him in a prior episode, if you'll remember. He was known as the Lonely Hearts Killer. But let's go back to the penitentiary. The West Virginia Penitentiary, located in Moundsville, became the site of state-sponsored executions starting in 1899. The first execution was the hanging of Shep Caldwell on October 10, 1899, for fatally shooting his mistress in a rage. 94 men were executed at the penitentiary, and one woman was sentenced to death but received a last-minute pardon. The executions included 85 hangings and 9 electrocutions. The state abolished the death penalty in 1865. 14 men were put to death for killing their wives. They included Frank Heyer, who, according to a newspaper account, was so heavy that his head popped off when he was hanged on June 19, 1931. I found this article about Frank Heyer. He's the reason they actually stopped public executions. Frank Heyer abused his wife, witnessed by many. Then on December 19, 1930, it got out of hand. He fatally beat Ava Heyer to death inside a restaurant, then barricading himself inside the police surrounded. He fired a gun outside, but wasn't really aiming. During his trial, Frank blamed alcohol, said he had no memory of the incident. No one in the jury believed him. He was found guilty and sentenced to hang. On the day of his execution, he was surrounded by guards and a priest. Talking up a storm, he turned to the priest and thanked him for the wonderful Christian experience, confessing to the murder over and over, saying whiskey caused it. In the gallows, over the trap, noose placed around his neck. As the reverend said a prayer, the trap opened and Frank fell. But something wasn't right. The pressure was too much. The rope squeezed Frank's neck with a hard jerk, slicing completely through, ripping his head from his body. Witnesses were horrified, and this was the end of public executions in West Virginia. I mean, no wonder. I could not imagine how gruesome that would be. On the other executions, of those executed, 40 were black. Note the racial disparity. They accounted for 43% of the executions at a time when the state population was only 8% black. For hangings, prisoners walked 13 steps to the gallows and were placed in a noose with 13 knots as a symbolic nod to the 13 people, 12 jurors, and a judge who convicted them. As I mentioned earlier, Shep Caldwell of McDowell County was the first man to be hanged at the new facility on October 10, 1899. Caldwell, a married man, fatally shot his mistress in a rage after he saw her with her boyfriend, Plugger said. Frank K. Johnson, a serial killer, was hanged July 17, 1908, on the eve of his death. He confessed to 5 murders. A Wheeling Register article about the hanging under the headline says Black Friday at the Penitentiary. Harry Powers, who I had mentioned earlier, was one of my Clarksburg Killers episode. He was hanged in March 1938. A triple hanging of Philip Cannizzaro, Dick Ferry, and Nick Salamente, members of the Sicilian Black Handers, took place January 4th, 1924. The group acquired its name for a habit of dipping victims' hands in ink. Another triple hanging occurred in 1938 for men convicted of kidnapping a minister who later died. They were sentenced under a federal law enacted after the kidnapping of the Lindbergh baby. The youngest man executed was Philip Human, 18, hanged August 20th, 1926 for killing a grocery store owner. Inmate Henry Jackson was hanged on September 10, 1926 for stabbing guard Earl Langfit with a homemade shank in March of that year. Langfit was the first correctional officer to die in the line of duty. The only Moundsville native to be executed was Raymond Stiers, put to death on May 13, 1938 for killing the wife of a Wheeling casino owner. The last man executed by hanging, Bud Peterson from Logan County, was buried in the prison cemetery because his family refused to claim his body. Beginning in 1951, electrocution became the means of execution. The electric chair used by the prison, nicknamed Old Sparky, which I think they all nicknamed them that, but anyways, it was originally built by an inmate there, Paul Glenn. The last execution carried out in the state's electric chair was that of Elmer Bruner on April 3, 1959. 9 men were electrocuted before the state prohibited capital punishment entirely in 1965. The original chair is on display in the facility and is included in the official tour. Conditions at the prison during the turn of the 20th century were good, according to a warden's report, which stated that both the quantity and the quality of all the purchase of material, food, and clothing have been very gradually but steadily improved, while the discipline has become more nearly perfect and the exaction of labor less stringent. Education was a priority for the inmates during this time, and they even regularly attended class. Construction of a school and library was completed in 1900 to help reform and educate inmates. Revenue from the prison farm and other inmate labor resulted in the penitentiary operating almost self-sufficiently. By the late 1950s, the prison offered inmate labor in a number of prison areas: a stone yard, bakery, hospital, and blacksmith, paint, wagon, tailor, and carpentry shops. The prison had its own band for recreation, which played in a bandstand located in the North Recreation Yard. Many inmates played on a baseball team that competed against local teams in the Moundsville and Ohio Valley area. For many years, the print shop published a magazine called Work and Hope. Church services were held in a large room on the second floor of the building. A notable inmate in the 20th century was labor activist Eugene V. Debs, who served time there from April 13th to June 14th, 1919. At which time he was transferred to an Atlanta prison on charges of violating the Espionage Act of 1917. By the 1920s, the female inmates were moved from the administration building to a separate 2-story building located in the northeast corner of the North Recreation Yard. This building had its own dining room and kitchen, in addition to cells. A high wall enclosed this section from the main part of the prison. During the time approximately 50 women were employed in part of the shirt shop, making collars and cuffs for the shirts made by the men prisoners. The other women were employed in domestic work within the prison. In 1921, a prison coal mine was opened about a mile away, which helped the facility with its energy needs and saved thousands of dollars each year. It also put inmates to work, some of whom were allowed to stay at the mine's camp under supervision of the mine foreman. In 1925, 2 new water wells were drilled that supplied the penitentiary, and in times of need could supply the city of Moundsville. However, the condition of the prison worsened over the years, and the facility would be ranked of the United States Department of Justice top 10 most violent correctional facilities list. One of the more infamous locations in the prison, with instances of gambling, fighting, and raping, was a recreation room known as the Sugar Shack. I watched a video that said over 70% of the prisoners had been raped while at the penitentiary. In total, 36 homicides took place in the prison. One of the more notable ones is the butchering of R.D. Well. Like many prisons, West Virginia Penitentiary had its own social hierarchy among the inmates. The prisoners had ways of helping each other, but they also had ways of dealing with the rats among them. Inmate number 44670, better known as R.D. Wall, was one such snitch who suffered the ultimate punishment at the hands of his fellow prisoners. On October 28, 1929, Wall was headed down into the bowels of the prison to where the boilers were kept when he was jumped by 3 other inmates. The men cut and stabbed at R.D. Wall with dull shivs. When they were finished, Wall was literally butchered into pieces. Wall is also connected to one of the earliest ghost sighting reports here at the prison, and I'll go into all that more in a bit. In 1929, the size of the prison was doubled as overcrowding had become a problem. 3 men were assigned to a 5-by-7-foot cell before this time, with 2 prisoners sleeping on the bunks and a third sleeping on a mattress on the floor. Inmate labor was again used to build a new wing connected to the south side of the prison and was completed in 1939. More expansion was also planned, but it was delayed by a steel shortage during World War II and wasn't entirely completed until 1959. The penitentiary housed approximately 80 women prisoners until 1947, when a new facility was opened at Penn Springs, West Virginia, and the women were transferred. The warden and his family continued to live in the administration building until a new dwelling was built just south of the penitentiary. The new Colonial Revival House featured a circular fish pond, side bay windows, a curved drive, a patio, tennis courts, and gardens. In the 1960s and 70s, many of the older brick buildings within the North Recreation Yard were removed and replaced with concrete block and metal buildings. One of the buildings removed had been utilized for church services. In the 1970s, the local Pastors Association donated the present chapel building in the South Recreation Yard. Prison inmates were tracked with bloodhounds. Prison trackers and guards were killed trying to stop escapees in 1942 and 1979. Famous former Moundsville prisoners include Charles Manson's family members, in parentheses, and the members from Bonnie and Clyde's gang. And Charles Manson tried to get transferred there, but was denied. One infamous prisoner was Tennis Hatfield, serving time for murder. Hatfield walked away from the prison grounds on June 2, 1967, and was caught and returned to confinement 9 days later. Now, I looked trying to find out more about Tennis Hatfield, and I couldn't find anything at all, except for that he escaped. I don't know if he was related to the Hatfields of the Hatfields and McCoy fame or not, but I'm thinking maybe he is, since the article mentioned him specifically, but who knows. On Wednesday, November 7, 1979, 15 prisoners escaped from the prison. One of the escapees was Ronald Turney Williams, serving time for murdering Sergeant David Lilly of the Beckley Police Department on May 12, 1975. He managed to steal a prison guard's service weapon in the escape, and upon reaching the streets of Moundsville, encountered 23-year-old off-duty West Virginia State Trooper Philip S. Kesner, who was driving past the prison with his wife. Trooper Kesner saw the escapees and attempted to take action against them, but the prisoners pulled him from his car and Williams shot him. Trooper Kinzer returned fire at the fleeing suspects despite being mortally wounded. Williams remained at large for 18 months, sending taunting notes to the authorities and making the FBI's 10 most wanted list. During that time, he murdered John Bunchek in Scottsdale, Arizona, during a robbery and was connected to crimes in Colorado and Pennsylvania. After a shootout with federal agents at the George Washington Hotel in New York City in 1981, he was apprehended and returned to West Virginia to complete several life sentences. Arizona had sought his extradition for execution, but as of October 26, 2024, he remains in West Virginia custody. January 1st, 1986 was the date of the most infamous prison riot in the history of the penitentiary. The West Virginia State Penitentiary was undergoing many changes and problems, and security had become extremely thin in all areas. Since it was a cons prison, most of the locks of the cells had been picked, and inmates roamed the halls freely. Bad plumbing and insects caused rapid spreading of various diseases. With the prison holding more than 2,000 men, crowding was an issue. Another major contribution to the riots cause was the fact that it was a holiday. Many of the officers had called off work, and prisoners planned to conduct their uprising on that specific day. Around 5:30, 20 inmates, known as a group called the Avengers, stormed the mess hall with Captain Glasscock and others were on duty. Within seconds, Captain Glasscock, 5 other officers, and a food worker were tackled and slammed to the floor. Inmates put knives to their throats and handcuffed them with their own handcuffs. Although several hostages were taken throughout the day, none of them were seriously injured. However, over the course of the 2-day upheaval, 3 inmates were killed for an assortment of reasons. The inmates who initiated the riot were not prepared to take charge of it. Danny Lehman, the Avengers president, was quickly agreed upon as best suited for the task of negotiating with authorities and presenting their demands to the media. Yet Lehman was not part of the 20 men who began the riot. Governor Arch A. Moore, Jr. went to the penitentiary to talk with the inmates. This meeting set up a new list of rules and standards on which the prison would build. National and local news covered the story as well as the inmates meeting with Governor Moore. Toward the end of its life as a prison, the facility was marked by many instances of riots and escapes. In the 1960s, the prison reached peak population of about 2,000 inmates. With the building of more prisons, the number declined to 600 to 700 inmates by 1995. The fate of the prison was sealed in 1986 ruling by the West Virginia Supreme Court, which stated that confinement to the 5 by 7 foot cells constituted cruel and unusual punishment. Within 9 years, West Virginia Penitentiary was closed as a prison. Most of the inmates were transferred to Mount Olive Correctional Complex in Fayette County, West Virginia. A smaller correctional facility was built a mile away in Moundsville to serve as a regional jail. Of course, a place like this is going to be haunted, or at least have rumors of being haunted. It just has to be. It's open now for paranormal tours, which I'll talk about a little bit more at the end. Though the prisoners are gone, they're not forgotten, and by many accounts, the ghosts of some of the 998 men who died here still roam free. There's a shadow man that has been seen and even photographed. Staff of the prison has been accosted by unseen forces. Strange noises still echo throughout the cell blocks, and something dark lurks in the bowels of the building. During its 119-year life as a penitentiary, the facility had some of the most violent killers, rapists, and other criminals, many of whom never left the institution alive. It comes as no surprise that this type of environment would leave behind more than a few wandering spirits. Another reason this old building may be haunted is because it is said that it was built on an ancient Native American burial ground, which I talked a bit about earlier. This will not be hard to believe, as the old prison was built directly across from the Grave Creek Mound, one of the largest conical-type burial mounds in the United States. Members of the Dina culture moved more than 60,000 tons of dirt to create it in about 250 to 150 BC. Some believe the negative energy from the deceased Native Americans infiltrated the prison, resulting in many of the paranormal events that have occurred here. The North Wagon Gate, the prison's oldest structure, is said to be home to one of the prison's most active ghosts. This area once held the execution gallows where a man named Orville Adkins was hanged in 1938. Here, visitors say the area exudes an evil feeling and they feel as if they're being watched. Mysterious sounds and voices have been captured in EVPs, and ghosts of the condemned are sometimes seen. The gate is haunted by Orville Adkins, who was condemned for kidnapping a minister and who was later found dead. However, his execution was botched. As the noose was being placed around his neck, a nervous assistant pulled the trapdoor handle too quickly, and Orville fell 20 feet to the stone walkway. Though he was stunned and hurt, he was still alive. He was then pulled back up to the scaffold and hanged correctly. His footsteps are said to be heard slowly pacing back and forth. The North Hall was where the prison's worst offenders were placed. Not for the crimes they committed outside, but for their violent behavior on the inside. Though they were locked down in their cells 23 hours a day, 2 murders occurred here. One was a biker named Danny, who was stabbed in the eye by another inmate and died of his hemorrhages. The other was William Red Snyder, who was convicted of murdering his parents and dismembered their corpses. Red was disliked by many inmates and involved in several fights. In the end, he was attacked in front of his cell and fatally stabbed 37 times. The hall has been the site of many strange events, including photographic anomalies, equipment malfunctions, the sound of cell doors banging when no one is there. Many have reported feeling very uncomfortable there. Red Snyder's cell is said to be particularly haunted. In the solitary confinement area, people have often reported feeling cold spots and as if they've been touched on their backs. Other hot spots include death row, the psych ward, chapel, shower cages, dining room, and boiler room. There's one particular entity called the Shadow Man because he lurks in dark places and has no visible features. He has been described as appearing like a dark shadow that is very intimidating. Throughout the prison, visitors and staff report seeing fleeting glimpses of apparitions, smelling unpleasant odors, strange noises and echoes, feelings of being watched, and a disembodied voice that says, "Help, I am trapped." The visitors have felt brushed, tapped, and even shoved by invisible hands, and cameras have captured ghostly mists, faces, figures, and orbs. Some have seen the ghosts of prisoners in uniforms walking the hallways and disappearing in the walls. The West Virginia Penitentiary is considered one of the most haunted prisons in all of the United States today. It is also listed in the National Register of Historic Places. The reports of paranormal activity at Moundsville Penitentiary are abundant. Many former inmates and guards have reported seeing apparitions, hearing strange noises, and feeling cold spots throughout the prison. One former inmate even claimed to have been pushed down a flight of stairs by an unseen force. Others have reported feeling full-body apparitions or feeling as though they were being watched or followed. One guard who worked there for 17 years said that he would often hear footsteps in the empty corridors. There are many different paranormal hotspots found around the prison, along with notorious figures. The Shadow Man, like I mentioned earlier, is the notorious figure who roams the halls in prison and watches those who come in and go. The Sugar Shack is one of the biggest hotspots of the prison, with people hearing voices, yelling, and arguing, while others are heard whispering and constant room temperature changes. Overall, there are a lot of unclean spirits that dwell within the Gothic structure, lurking around every corner. So that means you always must be alert, listening to every sound, and pay attention to every movement. If you're interested in pursuing the paranormal, be smart, safe, and most importantly, responsible with the decisions you make, contacting any spirit, and know the difference between good and unclean spirits to keep yourself from any dangerous situations with the paranormal. The chief ghostly presence at the prison is what's been called a Shadow Man. In 2004, well after the prison had been abandoned, an investigator to the site named Polly Gear took one of the more convincing and eerily profound paranormal photographs in recent supernatural history. At the end of a row of cell blocks, her shadow lens captured a picture of a chilling shadow man. Visitors to the area in prison have encountered a dark specter that appears in khaki clothing, which is what Wall was last seen in. It is also said that women have encountered the feeling of an unseen hand grip their shoulders. While Wall had an unhealthy affinity for women outside of the prison, he was thought of as a model inmate inside, and it was favored by the guards and his warden, but thought of as a prison snitch, always looking and lurking about. This is the most popular theory on who the identity of the Shadow Man is. Watching and looking from out behind the corners of cell blocks, his foreboding presence is terrifying enough. Today, the Moundsville Economic Development Council has helped to preserve the prison as a historic tourist destination. Tours vary in range from historical, photographical, group paranormal investigations, and overnight paranormal investigations. In fact, the prison is also home to one of the hottest paranormal conventions in the country, Paracon. The West Virginia Penitentiary website says touring is not the only popular reason people come to visit the West Virginia Penitentiary. Often called one of the most haunted places in America, those interested in the paranormal take advantage of the special events held at the pen. Halloween becomes a very festive time inside those 5-foot thick walls as guests test their mental limits against the dungeon of horrors. The penitentiary has proved to be a great place to learn, explore, excite, and entertain. All age groups find some value and amusement in our various offerings. You will find that there is something for everyone locked behind these doors. They have guided tours the daylight hours when open and a guided tour at night that leaves you out on your own to experience the prison. They also have an escape the pen escape room experience as well as a haunted house during the Halloween season. If you want to check it out, it's at 818 Jefferson Avenue, Moundsville, West Virginia. Moundsville also has other tourism opportunities. There are a ton of outdoor activities. I mean, this is West Virginia, remember? There's always outdoor activities. And there's a lot of places to shop and eat. A pretty cool place to visit while in Moundsville that I've actually been to and visited, I know, shocker, it's called the Palace of Gold. TripAdvisor says take a step outside the ordinary and visit the Palace of Gold, just 20 minutes from Highway 70 in West Virginia. Originally designed as a home for the founder of the International Society for Krishna Consciousness, the unique palace stands alone as one of the top religious wonders to see in the USA. Take a guided tour and learn about the history of the community and about the love and devotion that built this majestic place. Marvel at the intricate marble work and stained glass, crystal chandeliers, and of course gold. Relax by the Lotus Pond or take a stroll through our extensive gardens. The trip doesn't stop there. The palace is just one part of the greater New Vrindavan community, which features a vegetarian restaurant, lodging, and guest cabins, gift shops, peacocks, and much more. Finally, take in the Radha Vrindavan Chandra Temple, a traditional Vedic temple with the golden altars and a 40-foot high stained glass roof. Come and spend some time with us. We're happy to serve you. So, I remember visiting this place as a kid. There was a beautiful rose garden there, and this was in the late 18. This was in the late 80s, so I don't know if it's still there, but they did have elephant rides. It's like a little piece of India in the middle of West Virginia, and definitely worth visiting. I do have a bit of a funny story, though. We went there in 1986 or so, just a year or two after Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom was out. And in my mind, this place reminded me a lot of that palace there. So I was a little freaked out. We were going to eat at the restaurant there, and they made you take your shoes off, and that was the last straw. I was like 10 years old and was like, let's go home. That's it. Mom and Dad were going into the car with me, and this elephant was coming up the road, and they asked me if I wanted to see it, and I was like, nope, let's go. So I was ready to nope the heck out of there. So if you're a 10-year-old that's recently seen Indiana Jones, maybe not the best place to visit. Otherwise, I would definitely recommend. So that's it for today's episode. I hope you enjoyed. Not sure what next week's will be. I had an idea, but I'm not sure it's the one I want to do yet. Anyhow, as always, thanks for listening. You can follow me on socials under Poison Appalachia. I'm on Instagram, TikTok, YouTube, Lemonade, Threads, Blue Sky, and of course Facebook. I'm most active there. And also I have a website, poisonappalachia.com. If you're able, please like or rate me and share whatever podcast platform you listen to. Thanks. Talk to y'all next week.